This Hangout on Air is live. Welcome, everybody. I'm Brooke Lester. This is one in a series of OOTLE16 Hangouts on Air, and this is in service to the Open Old Testament learning event, OOTLE16. And with me today is Dr. John Miller. Hi, John.
Hi.
John is a professor of religion in the religion department at McMurry University in Abilene, Texas. Am I right about all that, John, still?
Absolutely. Yep.
All right. How long have you been there now?
I came here in 2004.
Okay. Wow.
So I stopped counting when it gets like that. But yeah.
You're getting old. Did anyone, do you know?
I know. Hey, I earned every one of the gray hairs in my beard. So
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So good. Welcome again. John is a professor, and I'll ask you about, let me ask you about this now. You're a professor of religion.
Yeah.
And I mean, when we do our formation, you were formed as a New Testament scholar.
Right.
And in fact, that was the degree, right? It was
Biblical Studies New Testament. Yeah.
Biblical Studies New Testament, and mine was Biblical Studies Old Testament. And then we go out and we get jobs, and one of a number of things happen, right? We end up either in some huge faculty where we have a very, maybe like narrow, not in a bad sense, but we have our specialty,
right.
that we teach. Some of us wind up in, I'm on a Bible faculty of about 4 or 5. A couple OT people, a couple of NT people, and other folks wind up being the Bible department, right. Wherever they go, and some folks wind up being the religion person, wherever they go. It's kind of all about scale, right? And I mean, supposedly by getting a PhD, we tell ourselves we can teach anything, and then we sort of see how that works out in practice. So what's your story? Where you?
So I'm in the middle group of what you described. I'm the Bible person in a small department of religion and philosophy. So in my department, I teach biblical. I mean, I have the freedom to go outside of these parameters, but what I was hired to do was to teach biblical studies in Greek within a religion department where we have a philosopher, a theologian, and a church historian, and then a practical. At some point along the way, we created a new major that required some practical elements, and so we were very fortunate. We have a great person in servant leadership who has a PhD in practical theology, and so we brought him in to do homiletics and pastoral care and counseling, that sort of thing. So if you look at a typical seminary curriculum and sort of the various areas of specialization, we have one person that sort of generally covers each of those.
So I'm at a seminary, and
yes.
So what we have is we've got our Bible people, our church history people, our theologians, and our practical people.
Right.
Pastoral care and preaching and congregational development and all those folks. It's a churchy place.
Right.
What I lack, of course, what I miss sometimes is we're here on the campus of Northwestern University, but we're not associated with Northwestern University. Right. And so what I feel like sometimes is literally right outside my window, but which I really in many ways don't have access to, is colleagues who are outside of Christian, Christian, Protestant, not faith-based, because we're it's a critical place, right? But we're associated with a denomination, and our bread and butter is MDivs who are going into some kind of ordained ministry.
Right.
And so what I don't have is, say, a cafeteria where I might go sit down with the history of religions person, or the theory of religions person, or even the world religions person, to say nothing of the philosophy department person,
right.
or be still my beating heart, somebody in the astronomers part of things. And so, how green for you anyway is the grass on that side of the street?
Yeah, and here, because we're a very small school, um, we I have that as an option. I mean, I can, if I want a carbolicious lunch, I can I can find my way into the cafeteria and sit down with a group of other faculty. And and at that table there will be a somebody who does poli sci, there will be somebody who does biology, somebody who does chemistry, and that sort of thing. um, I think in terms of how green the grass is, part of part of the answer to that has a lot to do with the kind of work we each do within a university setting, right? So if you're at a research institution, I think that cafeteria conversation looks different than it does at a teaching institution like the one where I work, where we're all involved in doing a very heavy course load. Our normal course load is 4 courses each semester. Um, I have a slight reduction of that for some administrative work that I do, but and so in any kind of a schedule like that, um, you know, those of us who are still really committed to research, that research is really localized to something, typically in the summer, unless you've got, an impending deadline, whatever, and, then it bleeds over. But just, 4 classes a semester is going to keep anybody hopping pretty quickly. And so those conversations from this side of the fence, at least in this little part of the pasture, if you don't mind the more southern reference, is what that looks like is we're talking not about our fields in any kind of theoretical sense. We're talking about the sort of common ground we share, which is the challenge that we face trying to get students to understand and metabolize the information that we're trying to provide for them. And so those conversations wind up looking sort of remarkably homogenous for all of the diversity of fields that would be otherwise available, because we're not talking about someone's research that they're doing in the lab. We're talking about the challenge that we have, that we each face, trying to get trying to find ways to convey information to a generation of students with whom we have some separation, some distance. There's a group of us were talking yesterday about some of the challenges of working with young people today who are in that 18 to 22 range, and sort of the simple fact that for so many of these people, the multiple choice test model of education, and all teachers sort of being motivated to teach to that test, one of the results is that you get a lot of people in this age range that are coming into college who have just had the inquisitiveness stomped out of them. There is no reward for being curious. There is no reward for exploration. It's finding process of elimination, A B C D E, which one of these is right. And so it's an intriguing thing. What I find in the classroom is very similar to what my colleagues in completely separate fields find in the classroom, is trying to get students to follow a logical thought process is really, really difficult when you have people coming from such disparate backgrounds. And so that's kind of what the pasture looks like over here. I don't know a whole lot about the individual research that my colleagues do. What I know a lot about is the challenges that they're facing look a lot like the challenges I'm facing.
Yeah, it is, oh boy, the inquisitiveness thing. I'm sitting here hesitating and stumbling because I'm like all of us, I'm aware that I just have no wise words
Yeah.
For addressing this. But at the same time, you'd think we would, because we do. We talk about it a lot, and it's not a matter of the kids these days. You know what I mean? Like we all know that, like, the problem isn't that they Snapchat too much. The problem isn't that, it isn't in their phones, and it isn't on their, whatever. But like and I try to check myself on golden ageism. It's like, just because my favorite people when I was growing up were in my circles, in my friends, among my peers, were kids who shared a sense of inquisitiveness, who had a sort of natural curiosity, and who wanted to figure things out, whether it was through science or art or reading fiction, or just, but folks who just wanted to voraciously engage things that were outside of their horizons and try to understand things in people that weren't familiar to them. But I know that wasn't true of everybody. I mean, I was in college in the mid 80s when everybody was getting MBAs, so that they could like retire at age 40 or something like this. It's like, that was, so that ethos was all around me and all around us. At the same time, I think a lot has changed. I think when I look for targets, I think of things like No Child Left Behind, the usual suspects, standardized testing, No Child Left Behind, and unfunded mandates like that, and this sort of thing. And having a child, I have a 15-year-old, and I know you have kids, and we've talked about we've talked about childhood education before, you and I, and my own 15-year-old will talk. I mean, I can remember, and he's one person, this is entirely anecdotal, but just having him to talk to, where, I mean, I remember when he remembers when he would say, I love to go to school. I love to go to school. I love to talk with my teachers about ideas. I remember him being frustrated that not everybody seemed to feel that way. Like the teacher would want to talk about some enduring understandings, big ideas, open-ended questions. And he would be frustrated that a lot of the other kids in the room, that there'd be a critical mass of kids in the room who just wanted to like screw around and stick straws up their noses and be walruses, and throw spit wads. But he loved school, and now, you can ask him and he'll just say straight out that he just finds very little of value there, that he's just, that there's just, and he'll say, it's just been worked out of me. It's just been beaten out. So watching that process happen, and I'll tell him, I'm like, it's like, I can see how someone winds up entering as a master's student, into, you do undergraduate, I do master's, can come into my room and not have a history of reading for fun, not have a history of engaging things for its own sake, not have a history, but rather, and there's something infantilizing, isn't there, about the student-teacher relationship. I think these are often folks who might very well like go into, like, they're especially second career students, who maybe go into a job and practice something that I would recognize as critical inquiry and curiosity and creative problem solving and an eagerness to engage. But as soon as you put a sign around their neck that says student and a sign around my neck that says teacher, I feel like there's a sense in which we fall into these infantilizing roles, where then all of a sudden the goal is to check off the right answers, find out what Lester wants to hear, say those things, check off the right answers, and get through so that they can go on to the next thing. And I know how much this is exacerbated by, it's after 2008, more of them are in more financially precarious positions, working longer hours at probably effectively lower paying jobs. And we require 2 years of field ed, right? So the church is extracting its labor, from them along the way. And we have ideas about how that should result in learning, but it's still 15, 20, 25 hours a week, that they're not just pursuing understanding,
Right.
you know? Yeah.
Yeah. And we, like I said, we were having a kind of a small colloquy yesterday, just in fact, talking about a lot of these same issues. And, one of the questions that comes up is, how do you incorporate this idea of sort of inspiring curiosity within a classroom structure? Because, what the model that we're all so, inscribed with is, I stand up here and convey information. You sit there and write it down. I ask you a question that is designed to make sure that you understand the information that I have just relayed. You give me an answer that shows me you understand that. And it's, talk about, coloring inside the lines. I mean, this model is so, in some ways it's so stifling. And so, one of the things that we're discussing is, to what extent is this something where, we need to take some responsibility, sort of break out of this mold and provide an opportunity within the class structure, to bring in the idea that, here, this isn't, this part of the class isn't going to be about me saying something and you writing it down and parroting it back to me. This is going to be about you thinking through, a particular set of circumstances or a particular issue or question. And, the difficulty there is, it's like you're saying, this is a systemic issue, right? When you have somebody who is trying to attain a degree, particularly if their second career, they've got a family, they've got, a mortgage, they've got, all these bills, and they're trying to make a career transition, and this is the way they're doing it. I think there really is a very real sense in which it's just, hey, look, tell me what I need to do to get this degree and move on, because I'm kind of stuck in a very uncomfortable limbo here. Yeah, and it's a huge challenge, because on one hand, I think we do bear a lot of responsibility for rethinking our own pedagogy and rethinking how we do this sort of thing, and how we can take some responsibility for inspiring curiosity. And on the other hand, what we have to realize is, when we walk in with something that, we've spent all this time thinking about, okay, this is how I'm going to break the mold. I'm going to, use this to inspire curiosity. What you're going to get is a bunch of people looking around going, is this going to be on the test? I mean, how is this going to affect my grade? And, while you're sitting there weeping that they've misunderstood exactly what you want to do, you just realize that you really are caught up in a systemic problem, and there is no Band-Aid that's going to, miraculously cure this problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So for example, something I've tried for the last couple of years, and I'm doing it now in my intro class. So I'll say what I'm doing, what I hope the results are going to be, and then sort of what some of the, just as you said, what some of the remaining obstacles that just don't get out of the way because of what I'm trying,
Right.
So contract grading is something I've been working in, where briefly, right, that students, they contract for an A, a B, a C, because we have to do grades, right? So they contract for an A, a B, or a C. And what they're contracting is to do a certain set of assignments. For an A, a smaller set for a B, a smaller set for a C. So basically an A is to engage more.
Right.
B is to engage a little less, and C is to engage a little less than that.
Right.
And as far as the individual assignments go, they're all graded on a rubric-based satisfactory or unsatisfactory basis, right? So whether you're doing your assignments to contract for an A, a B, or a C, each individual assignment, as long as on each of these four elements, engaging course materials, engaging the course's big ideas and essential questions, something about writing mechanics, for example, doing the whole assignment and not only part of it, things like that, that you have to do you have to meet the satisfactory mark on each of those elements, right? So that's the basic idea. And when learners ask me why we do, because it's unfamiliar, right? It's a very unfamiliar way to sort of work for a grade, and rightly learners end up with a lot of questions. And one of the big questions, I mean, the overall question of why, there's more than one reason why, but the one that's relevant to what we're talking about now is by the 6th or 7th week of a 13-week class, everybody should know what grade they're going to be getting, provided they keep doing things that they've learned how to do. Like by the 7th week, you know, you've learned how to score at a satisfactory level on these assignments. You
Right.
know what Lester means when he says engage course materials. You know what Lester means when he says do the whole assignment and not only part of the assignment. You know,
Right.
things like this, because you've gotten feedback week after week on the assignments that you are doing. So the theory, or part of the theory, is that by 7th or 8th week, fear should be removed from the equation. Grade-related fear should basically be out of the way. It's like, okay, I've agreed that I'm going to do enough work for an A or a B or a C, whatever it is that I want. I've learned how to accomplish what this professor wants me to do on these assignments. And what that ought to mean is those students who are inspired to take risks, to attempt things that they haven't attempted before, to explore ideas that aren't fully worked out, ought to be free to do so, ought to feel the liberty, you know, and the sort of safe space to do that. Doesn't always work out that way. Some students aren't going to want to do that, and usually they've contracted for a C or whatever, and it's like, well, okay, so we all, you know, it's fine. Yeah, you know, we've got a contract. It's cool. I do find that by the late part of the semester, even students who are of the disposition to take risks when they can and sort of shoot for the stars, or seek knowledge for its own sake, or just engage in like just open-ended curiosity, usually they're ground down so much by other classes, other responsibilities, the demands of my class, which are still there, that's an obstacle. You know, there's no doubt about that. I find it works well enough that I'm sticking with it and going to keep playing with it. But I am learning the limitations, and as you say, sort of learning what it does not accomplish. Right. Because it's not in isolation. It is part of a larger system.
Exactly.
All right. Well, we'll circle it. We'll see if we can solve this at some future date. Yeah.
And if we can, you know, we could tap into some of the real money, right? Because, you know, from the perspective of being word people, that's where the real money is. The real money is in education. When you can do this sort of education consulting, you take my paycheck and realize, oh, you know, no, that's a quarterly paycheck, right, instead of an annual paycheck. So.
Uh-oh. Did I freeze up for a second there?
Little bit.
Okay, looks like I'm back. Okay, good. Yeah, right. Like once you and I are ready to start, like, you know, putting up our blog posts that say, you know, the one weird, neat trick to, you know, make students find curiosity. Click here to find out what it is. Then we'll be ready to start making the real money.
That's right.
So in the meantime, right, you talked about research. You and I have both stuck with our research, the stuff that we research, for a pretty long time now. You did dreams, visions, and messages in the Bible way back at the dissertation stage, and it sounds like you're still interested in it after all these years.
I am. I still like this area of research. I think that to me is one of the real blessings. If you can write a dissertation and kind of make it through that kind of morass of, you know, issues, and still come out on the other side and really feel good about, you know, and excited about the sort of thing that you're studying. That's a wonderful blessing that I don't take for granted, because I've known a lot of people whose passion for that subject, and that burned really brightly in the beginning, just gets snuffed through that process. So yeah, I'm very happy to still be interested in what I started doing.
All right, so leaving aside just for the moment, I'm sure you can give the elevator version of why the study of dreams, visions, dreams, visions, and messages from God in the Bible serves some kind of good, and what makes it useful and what makes it good to study and what it accomplishes. But leaving that aside for a second, why do you still like it? Like, because believe it or not, there are probably people in the world to whom that does not immediately sound like something they want to spend 15 years of their life thinking about.
Right, which boggles my mind, but I'm sure you're right. And when I meet one of these people, I'm always, feeling a great sense of pity for them.
Well, what's cool about it?
So to me, and part of it, I can't quite give an answer without also doing part of the elevator speech, but they just happen to intersect in this case. So what's cool about dreams and visions in the Bible for me? My particular area of research was I did look at dreams and visions very broadly, not just in the Bible, but in, different materials from the ancient world. Looking at, a little bit of inscriptional evidence, looking at different bits of historical evidence. So what I focused on were the dreams and visions specifically in Luke Acts. And what I really love about that is the theological payoff that I find in studying that topic, and that is simply this. What happens in Luke and Acts, very simply, and a little bit too simply, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but what you have are situations in which people have a dream, or they have a visionary encounter, say with an angel or whatever, or they hear a voice from heaven. They hear a voice telling them exactly what to do. And then they walk away from that experience, and Luke shows them interpreting that experience, processing that experience. I think that's so valuable from a theological standpoint, because what that's saying is, okay, a lot of folks will read the Bible and they'll say, well, here God is again telling so-and-so exactly what to do. Of course they got it right? But Luke doesn't do that. Luke instead shows people hearing what they're supposed to do and still needing to process that, still needing to figure out what it means that they've been told to do this. And so you have this kind of beautiful process in the Lucan narrative where people have these encounters. They're in many cases confused about what this experience means, and then they begin to process it. They begin to work through it. And in sort of extreme examples, something in one of my most recent publications, I was doing a piece on the role of the Holy Spirit in Luke and Acts for my doctoral advisor's Festschrift. And one of my favorite things about looking at the Holy Spirit in Luke and Acts is looking at this tension near the end of Acts, where you have Paul, who has resolved in the Spirit that he's supposed to go to Jerusalem. And so this is where he's headed, and he lands in Tyre, right? And you just have this very tiny little piece of the story where the text says, they were staying with these, people in Tyre, I think for like a week or something. And it says these people in Tyre were telling Paul kind of, throughout this time through the Spirit not to go to Jerusalem. And so this idea that, two different groups feel inspired by the Spirit in completely opposite directions, I think it's a fantastic kind of focal point for understanding what happens in a lot of theological debates, a lot of church tensions. I think it's a fantastic focal point for our consideration when we're trying to grapple with these these areas in which we find ourselves not agreeing, or we find ourselves, sort of moving in different directions. So that's why I think it's cool, and that's why I still really enjoy it.
That's really, I like the way you talk about that. There's, in the Hebrew Bible, there's one of the things one of the things that I like to try to get across to learners when we're talking about the prophets, for example, in the Hebrew Bible is, because of the way that the Hebrew Bible has come together, it's very easy to get a sense that discerning prophecy and discerning the spirits is simple. Right. That, well, some prophets tell the truth and other prophets are just yes men who tell the king, what he wants to hear. But then, or some prophets get prophecy right, and if the prophecy comes true, then they're a true prophet. And even the Bible, like Deuteronomy, I think 18, if I remember correctly, or 17, maybe 18, is of that, you just wait to see if the prophecy comes true. And if it comes true, it's a real prophecy. And if it's not true, it's not a real prophecy. And then elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, and I can't remember where this is, takes that apart and says, well, it's not really a matter of, even if the prophecy comes true, but it's in the name of another God beside the God of Israel, then it's still not a true prophecy, right? So even what seem to be these very simple tools for discerning prophecy are shown to be not that simple. Right.
And they're only simple in retrospect, right? I mean, it sounds simple, but what if you're living when the prophecy is made and you have no idea, right? And you're stuck there waiting. Yeah, we're going to wait and see. I mean, there's nothing simple about waiting to see if something comes true or not. Yeah.
Which the God of Israel could care less about, right? That's that's when you get those really funny things where, like in Exodus 3, I suppose, where when I go back to the people, God, and they don't believe that I've really talked with you, what will I say? And it's like, well, this will be a sign that this is the real deal. After they leave Egypt and go with you to the mount where I will reveal myself, thus and so will happen. And it's like,
thanks.
It's like, talk about God's unclear on the concept,
Of course, by that time, God's just so frustrated with Moses that, but by the end, and this is actually my favorite all-time part. I love to mention this when I'm, doing a sort of a guest sermon in a church, because I can voice this off on their pastor to have to preach about this passage. But, where you get that place in Exodus 4, and you can kind of see what's happened. You've got this whole burning bush episode, which all anybody ever thinks about is sort of, removing your sandals, you're on holy ground, God calling Moses, this beautiful thing. But, by the end of this, God is really, really mad at Moses, right? Because it's just one excuse after another till finally, he has to, okay, look, I see your brother coming. He can talk, right? And then you kind of get this weird picture where, God goes off for a while, and you can just see God just stewing in this experience of, I burn this bush for this guy, I call this guy, I go through all these gyrations, he still won't listen to me. And so then in Exodus 4, you have this, and God tries to kill Moses. And all of the weird theological stuff that's wrapped up in that.
Zipporah is there to think.
God tries to kill Moses unsuccessfully, It's just beautiful. So nobody's ever taken me up on that, by the way. I've been checking, and none of the pastors have ever kind of taken up the gauntlet and preached that.
They don't preach about Zipporah thinking quickly and circumcising her son on the spot and rubbing the blood on Moses's genitals, and then God, like Swiper in just after the manner of Swiper in Dora the Explorer, sort of snaps his fingers and goes, "Oh man," and walks off the frame.
I mean, I would listen to that sermon. I would enjoy that sermon. Come on.
Yeah, there's a reason some of us wind up in biblical studies.
And this to all of your students who wind up watching this, please preach this sermon and send me a link. I want to. I want to hear what you do with it.
Take up the challenge.
That's right.
All right. So in on dreams, visions, and messengers, there's a talking point that a lot of us use because we still think that anybody cares about JEDP and the documentary hypothesis. Whereas
Don't they?
some of our peers like Brian Bibb have long since discovered that teaching students that the Pentateuch is a composite document is part of the, shaking up their worldview that has to be done before we can like put it back together in this other way. Brian Bibb is among those who have discovered that, like, no, students come in with absolutely no opinion about the Pentateuch, and they've never heard of, any of this Moses wrote the Pentateuch stuff and whatever. But for those of us who haven't gotten that memo yet, right? Part of how we teach this Wellhausen documentary hypothesis, JEDP business, is to talk about how the J writer, for example, in the J writer, God just sidles right on up, right? God walks in the garden and just comes right up to you and says, holy smokes, what did you do? Or God just, like, the classic one is the call stories for Abraham, right? Genesis 12, God just moseys right on up, says, hey, count the stars, blah, blah, blah. Look at the land. This is yours. And Genesis 17, and that's J, right? Genesis 17, God comes up and says, hey, and gives basically the same message, but it's in the context of a sign, and God has a particular name, right? And that resonates with Genesis 9, and we say, oh, it's the priestly writer doing his periodization of history, with where in each of these periods of history, God appears to a particular person using a particular name and offering a particular sign, like the Sabbath, for example, or what have you, or the rainbow and so on. And then finally, to our purposes, Genesis 15, where God appears to Abraham through a vision, right? And a dark sleep comes upon Abraham, and he sees this vision of a fiery or smoky or both pot, passing between the halves of the animals that Abraham has been instructed to cut in half, in this sort of classic ancient Near Eastern vignette where the one party cuts the animals in half and passes through the pieces and says, if I don't keep up my end of the covenant, may I be like these animals that have been cut in half.
Right.
And I mean, and of course, the theological goods that it's God who passes through the pieces, right? So God has, in a very literal, if symbolic sense, put God's life on the line, to be true to God's end of the covenant. But this is E, right? E is where God appears through dreams, visions, and messengers. And this ties into this sort of ancient Near Eastern cluster of images around the two gods, El, the high god, and Baal, his son, whereas Baal appears to you imminently in the storm, in the rain, in the fertility of the land. Right here in and among us, Baal is manifested imminently, with not in an unmediated way. Whereas El, the high god, he's off on a mountain far away in a tent, with a beard, sitting down on a throne and addressing a divine council. And this is the God who appears to you by sending a messenger, by sending a vision, by causing you, to have a dream. So there's this whole constellation of sort of talking points by which we try to contextualize this. And it basically boils down to the immediate God and the mediated God. And the dreams, visions, and messengers are associated with the mediated God. I'm gonna go way out on a limb and guess that on the New Testament side, that's not really how it breaks down. But is there anything when you talk about like dreams and visions in the new, is it dreams and visions dreams, visions, and messengers all the way down in the New Testament? Or can the God who appears through dreams, visions, and messengers, as in some of these episodes of Luke Acts, for example, is there something to which that's contrasted, or some things to which that's contrasted, or some ways of understanding God's presence and God's ways with people that's different in the New Testament, to which the dreams, visions, and messengers God can be contrasted? Or is that not even the case?
No, I think there is certainly with Luke Acts and Lucan theology, you have this kind of intriguing paradox. You never have Luke coming right out and saying, describing a situation where God interacts directly with a person. So very much getting at the kind of things you're talking about, that God comes to people through various intermediaries. The closest and most kind of direct link you have is the idea of, the voice from heaven, right? Which still is not, even though, okay, yeah, there's a barely any degree of separation here. A lot of folks will just read this simply as God's voice. It's never described explicitly as such. And so there's this very much this sense of God not directly involving God's self, but at the same time, you have all this other kind of, all this other imagery, which does suggest that God is working behind the scenes, right? You have, whether you're talking about these visionary encounters, where you're talking about the more seemingly direct voice from heaven, or whether you're talking about these angelic, intermediaries, or particularly for Luke and Acts, the role of the Holy Spirit, right? And how, and of course, this is where particularly undergraduates, but I'm sure MDiv students as well, are going to feel a little bit on shaky ground, because, when we think of Holy Spirit, we think very much in Trinitarian terms, and this is very wrapped up in, whatever tradition you're a part of, the sort of doctrinal understanding of the Holy Spirit's oneness with God. And for Luke, the Holy Spirit is absolutely crucial, but you never have Luke really unpacking that, what would become sort of a Trinitarian concept. And so, yeah, so there is this kind of both and, where God is not distant per se, but at the same time, for the most part, you have this kind of intermediary experience, whether it's the Holy Spirit, or whether it's a dream or a vision, or whether it's an unnamed voice from heaven that most readers are just going to conflate immediately with God. Yeah. So the difference, I think, would be that you don't have, certainly in those texts, you don't really have a sense of this idea is coming from one source, whereas this other idea is coming from a different source. Now, I can't speak for the golden age of redaction criticism, in the middle of the 20th century, that I'm sure there was somebody who came along and had, the Holy Spirit source or some stupid thing like that. But, oh, did I say that was stupid? Yeah, I actually meant that. So anyway.
Yeah, I said stupid.
It does sound stupid, doesn't it? So yeah, I'm sure that there was speculation along those lines, but it certainly never has really garnered any support. This seems more integrated, and I think what we're looking at there is, this idea that comes out of apocalyptic, where to varying degrees, interaction with God is something that requires an intermediary on some level. And so Luke is kind of doing this really strange both and, where he's using the intermediaries, but God isn't all that distant. And so it's just sort of an intriguing, sort of conflation of these different ideas, different traditions. It's kind of interesting to see how all that sort of gets mashed together as the centuries move forward.
Yeah. Okay, so you talked about, I'm thinking about the guild now. So and yeah, like when you talk about, like, that I'm sure there was some redaction critic back, decades ago, that posited like the Holy Spirit source, and then stuff like this. That's on our side of things, on the Hebrew Bible side. That's the person who takes the priestly writer and with complete confidence has broken it down into like 19 different priestly sources,
right?
And can say that this 2/3 of this verse is from this source, and this 1/3 is from these a composition of these other two sources by a third redactor.
And hopefully they found the right medication to treat that person. You just gotta hope, right?
So, all right. So now, right. I mean, if anyone asks me, and they should be careful about doing so, I can go on at length in my research area, which is allusion in the Bible, right? Biblical texts that allude to other texts. I can go on. I can bore anybody for a long time about what's missing in the field right now, like where right now some of the wrong tracks are being laid, and where there's some gaps where the right track could be laid, and some folks who are on the right track, you know. So for you, as someone who thinks about and writes about and talks about dreams, visions, and messengers in the dreams, visions, and messengers of God in the Bible, do you have that kind of a constellation of thoughts in your head about your research area right now? That is, do you have that feeling where it's like, oh, if some of my peers out there in the world who, you know, the 5 people who show up for the SBL AAR session on dreams, visions, and messengers in the Bible or whatever.
There's 5?
Maybe 5. Well, there's 2, but there's 3 people reading their live tweets from the session. So,
okay,
so as many as 5.
Right. They just run up in the room randomly, needed a place to rest. Yeah.
Yeah, but not counting the people who came in to get out of the rain. Are there things you wish that they would understand better, or things that you would like them to be looking into that they're not, or anything that you would just sort of like to bend their ear about or press upon them? Or conversely, do you think there are some folks who are doing some really intriguing and interesting things that you want to be engaged with, right? That you want to be a part of?
I think about this question very differently than you do, Brooke. For me, where I see people, going horribly, what I think of as awry, I am always just delighted, when that happens, because that means it's one less person. I do narrative criticism. And for anybody who's listening to this, if you just kind of think about the sort of general idea, when you have texts that are 2,000 to 3,000 years old, really, let's face it, all the good paper topics have been taken a long time ago. And so, when you're trying to conduct research, it's just wonderful to have people make what you regard as mistakes, because then they're at least not basically doing what you want to do before you can get it out there. When I met Robert Tannehill for the first time, who is for anybody who doesn't know, Robert Tannehill is one of the sort of pioneers in bringing narrative criticism into the conversation about Luke Acts. And so I remember meeting him at a session where I'd done a paper, and Tannehill is a very kind of staid, reserved person, so he didn't act like he got the joke. But when I met him, I shook his hand and I said, "Thank you for not publishing everything I would ever think of, in terms of these texts." Because what I found so many times as I was going through and looking at the passages I was interested in my dissertation, I think I had made this, really interesting connection, and, lo and behold, I'd pick up, Tannehill or Joel Green. And of course they had already long since, described that connection in a way far more eloquently than I could have. So I'm on the opposite side. When I hear people and I just think, wow, that's a load of garbage, I rejoice, in their production of garbage, because it's just, a little more wiggle room for me.
Nice. That makes really good sense. Yeah, my Tannehill, I think, would have been John Collins, right? Because I was writing on Daniel's use of Isaiah, and it's like, okay, please tell me there's something that you have left unsaid.
Yeah, you just, could you take a break for a while, please? I mean, just give somebody else a chance. Yeah, when I read Collins stuff, I just wonder, have you lived several previous lives as a biblical scholar? Because when he'll go through, just looking at something which is sort of, in fact, I'm looking at it now on my shelf, this introductory text, The Apocalyptic Imagination. And he's exploring some of the matrices out of which apocalyptic may have developed. And, I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, it really does. It seems like he's lived several lives as a biblical scholar, and, is now just sort of accumulating all this as he comes into his present career. So yeah, those people, It's wonderful that they're working, and so I say it very tongue in cheek. I don't like these people because
No, I agree. And well, now the problem now, though, of course, is that we've got Facebook, and so, for example, like,
you're friends with John on Facebook?
No, I'm not friends with John Collins on Facebook. This is part of my point: is that folks, these folks who came before us and that are still sort of like have a little bit of that, sort of after the manner of the venerations of one's ancestors, right? As long as they've come along sometime before you, they have something of the stature of the gods who walked the earth before us.
Right.
But what I can always tell myself about them is, I'll bet they've had really narrow lives, right? I mean, that if somebody's going to write more about apocalyptic than I can hope to forget in my lifetime, then I can at least tell myself that they've been tied to a chair and missing out on, say, human love and Star Wars and all of the things that go into sort of, and Marvel Comics and all the things that sort of make up a full life. But then now that I'm on Facebook with like my peers and folks who are maybe a couple 3 years ahead of me or my peers, what's really insulting is to see these folks who produce like crazy, right? And have no problem banging out like publications and guild activity and that sort of thing. And then I see that they're also spending their time on fantasy football.
Right.
Yeah. And there go my illusions.
It's why I don't do Facebook. The last thing in the world I want to see is actual evidence that this person that I think, the only way I can sort of look myself, in the mirror and not be completely ashamed on a daily basis is I think this guy has got to be zip tied to his office chair, has a catheter and, is sort of being force fed intravenous food. So he can just, he or she can just completely bang out this information. When you find out that they're real people and even their out of office lives are better than yours, that's just too demoralizing. I don't like that. So I stay away from all electronic media for that reason.
Yeah, and let's just go ahead and look right at the camera and tell these folks, you know who you are.
Yeah, you do know who you are. And seriously, I mean, like I said before, take a break, please.
Yeah, please.
You've done what you've done. You've got it, right? You don't need to keep doing this over and over and over again. We got it. We're shamed.
Yeah, they're not going to do that. They're not going to take that break. So
no, they're not.
All right, John. Let's. We're coming up on an hour. So rather than get into some whole new thing, you mentioned redaction criticism, and I was going to get into that, but we're not going to do it. We're going to save it for another day.
Right.
Thanks for coming around, and thanks for talking about teaching, and thanks for talking about dreams, visions, and messengers, and both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It's great to have you.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good. Once again, this is John Miller. He's professor of religions in the religion department at McMurray University in Abilene, Texas. So that's John. There's a lot of John Millers. If somebody's trying to search for your work, give him a time. Did you
call me at home? I mean,
did your dissertation? By the way, did your dissertation wind up? Is that accessible or some version of it? Right.
Accessible is that's a relative term. If my dissertation, it was published by Brill in the Biblical Interpretation series, and so the title is "Convinced God Had Called Us: Dreams, Visions, and the Perception of God's Will in Luke Acts." I want to say it's Biblical Interpretation series, BINS.
Yeah.
I want to say it's volume 85. It's accessible in research libraries. When I do talks where I mention it, I don't even suggest that private people would buy the text, because I think they charge something like $180 for it. So I get an author's discount of 50%, and I can't afford it. Yeah. I'm thrilled though. I love Brill. I'm delighted they published it, because as far as I know, it's still in print. And that just doesn't happen if you're at a lot of different publishers. So yes, it's very accessible in research libraries. And then I've done, a couple things more recently. A couple of our colleagues from Princeton, Matt Skinner and David Downs did a Festschrift for Beverly Gaventa called "The Unrelenting God." That was the piece where, or that was the volume where my some more recent work on the Holy Spirit has come out. But yeah, if anybody's interested in dreams and visions, we are kind of a small group of people. Shoot me an email at McMurray, and I would be glad to talk with you.
Fantastic. Good. Thanks again. And once again, this was I'm Brooke Lester. This was in service to OOTLE16, the Open Old Testament Learning Event 2016, which you can find at OOTLE16.net. John, stick around for a second. I'll say goodbye to you properly, but we'll end the broadcast. Good. Thanks again, and thanks everyone for watching.